Okay, so that's it. What I want to do is basically give some basic definitions of what is an argument. We're looking at the sort of logos bit now. When is an argument well presented? What different types of arguments are there? What are some common fallacies or errors that we encounter when we're talking about arguments? So let me say something first. There is what is an argument? We're going to define what an argument is. An argument is not, okay, I had an argument with my girlfriend or boyfriend. I had an argument with my parents. An argument is a means of persuasion. It's a means of presenting information in a way that is consistent and logical, so that you are guiding your audience's intellect. You're guiding the person who you were speaking to. You're guiding their intellect to a conclusion. You're making the conclusion more credible. Okay, you're drawing sort of the necessary sequences, so that once they arrive at the conclusion, if they've accepted what you've presented as evidence, they say, okay, you know what, I'm willing to accept what you're saying. So an argument is a means of persuasion. It's a means of trying to convince somebody of something. And you are going to convince this person of something through this argument. This argument is sort of like a molecule. It's a molecule of separate statements, which we're also going to be defining. These are very, very elementary definitions. But it's a series of statements that are presenting little morsels of evidence or ideas, connections between ideas, so that the mind is gradually led to accepting the conclusion. That's one way of persuading somebody, and it's a very like noble way of persuading somebody. It's why I say it's noble is because if you present somebody with a good argument, what you are doing is you are giving them the means to understand and in some sense arrive at the conclusion for themselves. You are giving them the pieces of the puzzle so that they see the completion, they see the connection. It's not the only way of persuasion. And as we said, just getting set up here, an argument can also be sort of hijacked. You can hijack logos. You can be presenting statistics and information that's actually wrong or is fraudulent or is sort of, digitally doctored. That's a possibility. So just because somebody is using a sort of logos approach to persuasion doesn't mean that what they're presenting is truthful or that they're sincere or they're honest. But I'm getting a little bit abstract here. The point that I want to make is that what's the point I want to make? Is that that's one way of persuasion. It's one means of persuasion. There are other ways that you can persuade people. Okay, you could just basically stand up at the podium and scream the loudest, and people will be persuaded by that. You can also, let's say, physically and morally abuse somebody. You could just torture them to the point where you get your idea into their head. You can brainwash them. Okay, but there's something about argumentation which is, in some sense, respectful, because you are saying to the person, I recognize that you have a functional intellect, and I trust that once you see the evidence, your intellect will sort of gravitate to what is true. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. So let's just consider this. You see your neighbor mowing his lawn barefooted, and you ask him, why are you mowing your lawn barefooted? And he's going to give you sort of a simplistic argument. He's going to say, most lawn mowing accidents involve people wearing shoes. Therefore, by not wearing shoes, I'm statistically decreasing my chance of getting into an accident. So you see the argument. There's really sort of two statements. He's giving you a sort of a statement which presents some sort of statistical information. Most people who get into a lawn mowing accident are wearing shoes. I am not wearing shoes. Consequently, conclusion is my chances of getting into an accident are decreased. Does this make sense? So now, first point is your mind can tell you that this doesn't make sense without being able to tell you why it doesn't make sense. What we're trying to figure out is not that it doesn't make sense. It may be obvious to you that this sort of little argument here doesn't make sense, but why doesn't it make sense? Okay, and then we can sort of unpack it different ways. Anybody want to give me an answer as to what's wrong with this idea that he's presenting? Or how would we convince him otherwise? you can say, for instance, well, there's a few ways you can proceed. One way they can proceed is he's making a sort of a causal argument that there is somehow a strong correlation or a necessary causal connection between shoes and lawn mowing accidents, and you can start to basically analyze that connection. Is there really such a connection? What would the connection be? Doesn't seem to be one. And furthermore, you can actually, he's presenting it like a little bit statistically. You can look at those statistics, and you can say, in other words, this is what the fallacy boils down to. It boils down to, it's not that the people that got into an accident because they were wearing shoes. They got into an accident and they just so happened to be wearing shoes. So that is to say, you have to sort of diffuse the connection that the shoes are somehow involved in the augmentation of likelihood of getting into an accident. It would be something like saying, like, everybody who has ever eaten carrots eventually dies. So carrots are a cause of death. That's true. It's true that everybody that has ever eaten carrots has died or eventually will die necessarily, but it's false to attribute it to the carrots. Or like everybody that breathes oxygen dies. Yes, but not because of the oxygen. And furthermore, you would be able to see that statistically, that if you would actually do the study, you would see that, yeah, albeit there are fewer people that mow their lawns barefooted, so you'd have a smaller group of comparison. But when you actually did this sort of experiment of the experimental group versus the control group, people wearing shoes and not wearing shoes, even though the numbers in those groups are different because most people are wearing shoes, you would expect to find that it would be strange to find anything other than the same proportion, okay, the same distribution, the same number of people in each group getting into accidents. Okay. Now you might say, and this is something that has come up in a few semesters in the past, is, well, why don't you just leave them alone? You know, why do you feel the need to correct this idea? And yeah, sure. I mean, here's sort of your neighbor, you're friendly and so on. You don't want to talk to them, don't talk to them. That's fine, and that's a sort of a good stance to take. Is most people, most time, just leave people alone, even if you assess that their ideas are sort of wrong and stupid. You say it's okay. I'm not feeling sort of like an educator today or moralistic. Sort of live and let live, and that's fine. That is fine, but we have to recall that some beliefs translate to actions, and some of these actions are dangerous. They're dangerous to the person, they're dangerous to their finances, they're dangerous to their health, they're dangerous to the environment. So if somebody's, let's say, a white supremacist, you may want to challenge those person's ideas. It's not like that is to say, you can't just like sort of live and let live. Okay, like somebody like Hitler, this person has bad ideas. So regrettably, you have to try to either get that person to rethink their ideas, and that's not always possible. Okay, people are deep in and stuff like that. And regrettably, and this turns into sort of this question of policy and policing and legitimate use of force. Sometimes you have to prevent somebody who is not persuaded by rationality. You have to then nonetheless, you have to go to war. You have to constrain the person from acting. You have to deprive them of their freedom to act on their beliefs, because their beliefs are, we regard them as bad. That's true. There are dangerous beliefs. So yeah, I mean, for the most part, live and let live. Let people be. If you don't want to tell this guy he's wrong, that's fine. Everybody has some sort of wrong ideas that they act upon. But there are some bad ideas that need to be addressed, and you try to address them initially with logic. And if that fails, then your options to respond become more and more marginal and potentially more and more dangerous. Okay. So this is what we have to do. Okay, we have to also overcome this idea that everybody has an opinion. First of all, you don't, as we said with Socrates, you don't have to feel the need to have an opinion on everything. It's actually a pretty badass position, like Socrates, to say, no, I don't have a particular opinion. And I can question your opinion without necessarily having to present my own opinion. That's a strong intellectual position. You know what I mean? Because then some people have this attitude of being defensive by supposing that you are necessarily presenting the opposite to their view. So you don't necessarily have to have an opinion. And it's a very strong intellectual position, because then you can say, I'm questioning your opinion without necessarily advocating the opposite. It's a very strong position to be in an argument. But this is what Douglas Adams said, okay, famous novelist. He says, not all opinions are equal. Some are a very great deal more robust, sophisticated, and well supported in logic and argument than others. So not all opinions are equal. That's sort of a fantasy maybe that they gave us when we were, in kindergarten and grade 1. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody's opinion is equal. No, that's simply not true. Okay, that's simply not true. Some opinions are better than others, and some opinions are stupid. Okay, and some opinions are so bad that they need to be challenged. So sort of like, well, let's agree to disagree. That's okay sometimes, but there's other times where that's actually deplorable. Okay, so what is a statement? Very basic. I'm going to try to go through this part quickly because I want to talk about the deductive arguments. It's a little bit more interesting. A statement is an assertion, okay? It's a claim. So I'm going to use those words interchangeably, a statement and claim. A statement is, you're saying that the world is this way, or this particular thing is such a way, okay? It's a sort of declaration of a certain state of affairs. It's an assertion that something is the case. So you say, my car is red, my car is black, I'm your teacher, the world is round, the light travels at 300,000 kilometers a second. These are, I'll give you some examples. But in natural spoken language, a claim has a function. It has a function of conveying some information. And so there is this other variable that pertains to claims and statements, which does not apply to other things, which is a statement or a claim can be true or it can be false. Okay. And this idea is that ultimately, statements are either true or they're false. If I say that there's ice on the surface of Mercury, that's either true or it's false. If I say the world is round, it's either true or it's false. Okay. If I say that there's alien life on other planet, ultimately it's either true or it's false. A statement has what we call a truth value. But for our sake, and sort of being pragmatic, we have to say, yes, statements are true or false. And that is to say, once they are true, they are established to be objectively true, and so they're true for everybody. So it would be meaningless to say something like, Elvis is alive for me, even though you believe that he's dead. That doesn't make sense. Somebody is right and somebody is wrong. Okay, it doesn't make sense to say, Tupac is dead for you, but he's alive for me, or Jim Morrison is dead for you, but he's alive for me. Okay, that's just not how things work. Every time somebody comes in here, I get kicked off the full screen. Okay. But as I said, pragmatically, we have to realize that we're not always in a position to know decisively whether a statement is true or false. We simply do not have the information. So a lot of our assessment of the truth or the falsity of a claim depends on our own subjective awareness, okay, our own subjective ignorance. So if you say, for instance, there is life on other planets, is that true or is it false? Well, if you listen to Carl Sagan and so on, you would say, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I'm willing to say that, I would bet 99% that there's life on other planets. If you say 9/11 was an inside job, I would say, I don't know for sure, and in some ways it's impossible to know with certainty. So as a sort of a pragmatic critical thinker, as I said in a previous class, we have to try to get away from this idea of true or false outright. And I need to know. You're just not going to know. We are limited human beings. So have to say, like if I'm being really fair and really honest, was 9/11 an inside job? I would say, based on the evidence that I've seen, I would say like 99, 98%, it's probably not an inside job. But you can never know with certainty. Okay. In the same way that you can never know with certainty that they landed on the moon. Again, I would say I would give a high degree of probability, a very, very high degree of probability that Apollo 11 landed on the moon. Can I know personally with 100% certainty? No, never. Okay. I mean, yeah, maybe, I'd have to go to sort of the moon, and then I have to like cross compare, you know, the astronauts' boot prints with on the moon with the, what's in some museum, but even that could be tampered with. You can never know anything with absolute certainty. We already made that point. So undecided doesn't mean, well, it's 50-50 and anybody's guess is as good as anybody else's. Undecided means a probabilistic assessment. It may be 60%, 70%, 90%. You might say 99.999%. It's true. Philosophically, it's difficult that you're going to arrive at 100% certainty. Okay, there's some sort of generic lessons here. But what we want to try to do as good critical thinkers is we want to suspend our judgments as much as possible and gather evidence and research so that we can make an informed decision. We can have an informed opinion. I think that that's what matters more. It's not so much about having an opinion. Actually, in this day and age, nobody cares about your opinion. Opinions are a dime a dozen. What has value is an informed opinion, okay, a well-researched opinion. The strength of your beliefs should depend on the quality of the reasons in favor of that statement. And that's basically what an argument attempts to do. So these are some statements, okay? A triangle has three sides. This is what I've heard, okay? I find this one kind of paradoxical. And I forget his name. It's attributed to like an African student or something like that. Hot water freezes faster than cold water. That's paradoxical, okay? Seemingly there is true, okay? I don't know. If I would give this as an assessment, I would say, I only heard about this sort of superficially and in passing, and it seems as though there are some reasons being presented for it that I would give this assertion: hot water freezes faster than cold water. I would say it's like, probably 75% true, but I may very well be wrong. There's a very good chance that I'm wrong. Saturn is less dense than water. There's nowhere to land on Saturn. And that's also, think about that. There's nowhere to land on Saturn. It's just gas. So you just slowly descend into this cloud of gas until you just get crushed by gravity. It's fantastic. Okay. 7 + 5 = 12. Girls love receiving flowers as gift. You should never hit your mom with a shovel. Cigarettes cause cancer. Blowing into your Nintendo game cartridge gets them to work every time. Men can't handle the pain of childbirth. There are black holes in space. Fire festivals and exclusive luxury party on Pablo Escobar's private island. These are all statements. Okay. Some of these statements are true. Some of these are false. And the point is, how you establish the truth of a given statement is very, very different. How you establish, for instance, that there are black holes is very different from, for instance, how you establish some historical claim that Hitler committed suicide is very different from how you establish that cigarettes cause cancer. So there are many, many different considerations. How you establish the truth of a psychological claim is different from how you establish the truth of a astrological claim. And these things are fascinating. Okay, it's like, how do you establish that cigarettes cause cancer? You have to establish that by these sort of longitudinal studies where you're collecting a lot of statistical data. And again, there are people that get lung cancer that never smoked a cigarette. And we all know the people, we all have somebody, we've all heard the argument of somebody say something like, well, my grandfather smoked for 30 years and he never got cancer, so cigarettes can't be that bad. This sort of misplaced argument based on a singular data point, sort of anecdotal argument. But I mean, we do establish it as true. We'll come back to this. These are all statements insofar as they are sort of asserting something as being true. Everybody, you guys don't know this. Some of you guys don't know. Some of you guys still have these things, okay? Nintendo and Nintendo 64. This is a classic technique, okay? Blowing it. You got to go at a right angle, okay? You got to get right air pressure, and it works, okay? Now, does it work just because you're retrying it, or does it work because, nobody knows? It's a mystery. I don't know. It's probably actually doing more damage to the cartridge. These are things that are not statements. Questions are not statements. Okay, does a triangle have three sides? Does God exist? That's not a statement. An answer to a question is a statement, and then we can say, okay, we can determine whether or not yes or no, true or false. Assertions are not statements. So if you say, come to class, do your homework, turn off the lights, it doesn't really make sense to say when he said do your homework, that was true. True or false does not apply to questions. It applies to answers to questions. True or false does not apply to, utterances or imperatives, such as, shut the door, turn off the music. What we need to know is this when we're dealing with an issue. This is very important, but it's sort of a side point, is when you're dealing with an issue, you need to be able to figure out, wait, what the hell are we talking about? Okay, because there may actually be more than issues have a tendency of getting all sort of bundled up and tangled up. So we need to know what the hell we're talking about. So let's say if you say, are we in favor of the trucker protests in Ottawa? And you start talking, people start to converge and diverge on a bunch of different issues. Oh, where's the GoFundMe going? Are they white supremacists? Are they racists? Are they anti-vaxxers? Are they, being aggressive towards healthcare workers? And these are not the same thing. You know what I mean? Let's say the legitimacy of the cause and the intention of the organizer. And so all these things get sort of confused. So we need to say, okay, what are we actually talking about here? And we're talking about, let's say, our position with regards to, let's say, these pandemic mandates. We're not talking about the legitimacy or the underlying political intention of the organizers. Let's talk about this first, and then we can talk about that, and then we can see if that is relevant to this. But you need to figure out what you're talking about. Okay. So for instance, this could be anything. And you might be listening to your friends talk about sports. You might say, okay, who's the greatest, hockey player in the past decade? Is it Sidney Crosby or McDavid, or is it Alexander Ovechkin? And what you might start realizing is, if you pay attention, there's not actually talking about the same thing. One guy's talking about who's won the most awards, and the other guy's talking about who scored the most points. And my personal favorite is when you're listening to friends argue, and you realize that they're actually passionately arguing, very defensively, the same position. Okay, and then you guys say, wait, you guys are both stupid, because you guys are screaming at each other, not bothering to pay attention and realize that you guys are actually saying the same thing. Okay, you're just approaching it from different sides. So we need to know what we're talking about. That's very important. And that's something that's also important, because that can be utilized, that distraction, that space of distraction can be utilized rhetorically. It can be utilized by politicians and so on. Politicians love to do that. They love to distract away from the issue, especially in a debate, so they don't have to actually focus. They distract the audience's attention away from the issue that was actually posed in the question, so they can address an issue that is more favorable, that they've actually rehearsed the answer to. So you need to, okay, well, wait, actually, you haven't actually answered the question. Okay, let me skip over this. So, again, very simple point is, when somebody, including ourselves, is taking a position on an issue, we need to ask what is relevant to that issue. What is relevant to that person's position? Okay, what is relevant? What is not relevant? Okay, and this is a distinction that I do want you to retain. And I think that this is not a perfect distinction, but I think that insofar as we are critical thinkers, if we understand this distinction, it saves us a lot of headache. Okay, this distinction really saves us a lot of sort of intellectual energy, so that there are things that we just simply don't have to get involved in. But the distinction between what we would call a factual issue and a non-factual issue, I want you to retain this distinction. So what is this distinction? Okay, this is basically a factual issue is one that once it is established, and how is it established? It is established through a method which the opponents agree upon. We agree upon, let's say, the terms and conditions of the test, and then we do the test, and we arrive at an answer. And once we arrive at that answer, one person is declared right, the other party is declared wrong. So if I say, is Osama bin Laden actually dead? That is a factual issue, in that if it's true, and it's objectively true. It's true for everybody. And there are a few things to understand with regards to this. A distinction from that is Obama better looking than Osama? That is a non-factual issue. That is to say, it's more subjective in nature, and people can have different criteria by which they arrive at an answer to this, and there is no objective answer. But I want to come back to, there's something that I want to say about non-factual issues. But what interests us in this class is issues pertaining to fact, and the establishment of fact and the verification of fact. This is what we're doing in this class, okay? Because we're looking at factual issues, okay? We're not looking at non-factual issues. Let's say in the ethics class, we will be talking about non-factual issues. Let's say, is the death penalty just? There's no, science is not going to give you an answer to that. It's not based on fact. You could use facts and statistics to build an argument with regards to the death penalty, but ultimately has to do with things such as values and definitions of justice, which are dependent on how we are defining them. You wouldn't say, well, the world is round based on how you're defining it. No, it's just round. Let's drop this sort of elaborate semantics. The world is round. Okay, that would be a factual issue. So let me start with that one. This one backwards. Okay, two things that are implied by a factual issue. And the one that I want you to retain is that there is an established method for settling the issue, that any rational person would agree that this is a fair standard. It's a fair test. You say, well, you might say that. You might want to say, well, who's deciding how we determine what is factual or not? Is that the rational people involved in the debate will mutually arrive at the terms. Okay, so if you say, if I say the world is flat and my cousin says the world is wrong, I can say, okay, then here, let's look at some pictures from, Hubble Space Telescope. Let's look at some pictures from NASA. And he might say, no, we can't count on NASA because they're part of the conspiracy theory. So, I mean, that's getting a little bit absurd in and of itself, because there are ways of establishing that the world is round without having to literally escape Earth's orbit and then turn around and look at planet. So let's suppose that's the case. Suppose there's only one way to convince them, which is we now have to take this expensive trip to outer space, and we can go far enough so that at one point we can turn around and we can observe the curvature of Earth. And if we do not observe the curvature of Earth, I will say that I'm wrong and he's right. And if we do observe the curvature of the Earth, the issue is settled. It's finished. Okay, it's finished, and we move on with our lives. We move on to newer problems, newer challenges. Okay, there's no shortage of challenges facing humanity, but this one is done. We don't have to come back to it. The book is closed. The issue is settled. It's resolved. Okay, if we go out into outer space and we turn around and we observe that there is a curvature to the Earth, and he says something like, "Oh no, this is fake. It's a hallucination. You drugged me." Then at one point you have to say, "Look, I love you and everything, but I'm finished with this issue with you," because it doesn't appear as though there's going to be any standard of testing which is going to get you to admit that you are wrong. In other words, now you're dealing with somebody that's sort of more, it's more sort of, their factual claims are not actually factual. They're actually more sort of dogmatic or religious. They have more of a sort of a cult belief rather than a scientific belief. So there's at that point, you just have to sever ties with that person, at least with regards to that issue. You say, you're my cousin and I love you, but we don't talk about flat Earth anymore, because you're just completely, you are not adhering to any intellectual or rational standard that I'm aware of. Okay. But the point is, there is an established method for settling the issue. Yeah, and we can go back to this whole idea of credibility. The first point that we made about who should we listen to, and we said the first person we should listen to is the person that tells the best story, the story that makes the most sense, the quality of the argument. That's the gold standard. And if you listen to, let's just give one example. I should have given it last class, but for instance, if I listen to people that are telling me that COVID vaccines are safe, okay. Now, I'm not an expert, but I sort of get a sense of the logicality of and what they're saying and how they define their terms and how they approach the subject. And then let's say I'll spend 2 hours diving into that content, swimming in that content. And then I'll stop and I'll spend 2 hours swimming in the content of the anti-vaxxers. And then I emerge. So how do I feel about sort of this both equal time allotted to these two different parties? And I might come away and say these anti-vaxxers, their argument is sort of a fucking mess. They don't really know what the hell they're talking about. Their definitions are not clear. It's a lot of sort of speculative claims, these broad speculative claims. They don't seem to have the same credentials as these people. They are shooting a lot of sort of attacks, and they're making a lot of analogies that don't really hold up, and a lot of exaggeration. Whereas these people are sort of more slow, methodical. Their definitions seem to be just more clear-cut. Okay, these people are sort of more nuanced. They're willing to say when the vaccines work and when they haven't worked and what are the dangers associated with the vaccines. Whereas these people are more sort of extremists. They're presenting a sort of more all or nothing sort of thing. So look at the method by which the people are presenting their ideas. Okay, that's one thing. And another implication of this is that if two people disagree on a factual issue, at least one of them is wrong. If I say, what time is it in Singapore right now? And you say, it's 10 p.m. and somebody else says 11 p.m., at least one of them is wrong. If I say Elvis is dead and you say Elvis is alive, at least one of us is wrong. Okay. It doesn't make sense to say, for you, again, with regards to a factual issue, it simply does not make sense to say Elvis is alive for me, but he's dead for you. And that doesn't make sense. That's just, there are some things in the world that are like that. I think this meal is good, but you don't seem to agree. Okay, you know what I mean? I think that this hockey player is the best hockey player. You don't seem to agree. It's okay. We have different criteria, how we're defining it. But when it comes to, let's say, with the world being flat or round, it doesn't make sense to say, oh, yeah, well, we just live in different stories of the world. It's not intellectually satisfying. There are some things that are factually establishable, okay, and verifiable. Now, I just want to make one sort of passing comment with regards to non-factual issues. It's not really important, but I think it's important in terms of the discussion, but not important in terms of what I want you to retain. But a non-factual issue, just because something is a non-factual issue doesn't mean that it's actually not important. And there's two things. It doesn't mean that it's not important, and it doesn't mean that you can't win an argument with regards to a non-factual issue. A lot of the issues that we actually deal with are extremely important. Okay, questions about what is the meaning of life? That's a non-factual issue. Science is not going to tell you what the meaning of your specific life is. Seems to be a pretty important issue. How do we organize society? What do we make of justice and fairness and equity and equality? Science is not going to tell you how to organize society. Science is not going to tell you how to define justice, but it's something that you can't get away from. So there are some ethical, non-factual issues, such as ethical issues, that are important and you can't ignore them. And furthermore, so first point was, just because it's non-factual doesn't mean it's not important. And furthermore, doesn't mean that anything can be said with regards to non-fact. If you, for instance, say you're for the death penalty, and you say, why are you for the death penalty? I'm for the death penalty because my daddy was for the death penalty, and my daddy's daddy was for the death penalty, and my great-granddad was the town hangman, okay? And somebody else is, let's say, against the death penalty, and they're a lawyer defending people on death row, and they say, okay, I'm opposed to the death penalty because it actually statistically does not decrease crime. It does not act as a deterrent. There are executions that are actually botched and the person is tortured. There are racial issues with regards to inmates on death row. And there's always the issue that you may sentence somebody to death who is otherwise innocent. And there have been people that have been proven innocent once it's been too late and they've already been executed. So now all of a sudden it starts to look like, the argument against the death penalty presented by this lawyer defending human rights is stronger than this sort of belligerent, strange argument made by this redneck. Okay, so no, not all arguments with regards to non-factual issues are equal. That's also interesting. Okay, so will acupuncture, if I go for acupuncture, will I feel better? Is that an issue? Is that a factual issue? Can we sort of establish it somehow factually, or verify it, or establish it statistically? In some sense, yes. I mean, we can just ask people if they feel better once they come out of acupuncture. And mostly you're going to say, yeah, people do feel better once they've gone for acupuncture. But then you can ask another factual issue, which is, well, why do people feel better after they've gone for acupuncture? And then you can make this cross comparison between what we would call real acupuncture versus placebo acupuncture, or what you would call theatrical acupuncture. And then you start to figure out what makes sense and what seems to have some bearing or not. Okay. Okay. What the heck is going on? Starting subtitles. Okay. And what is an argument? We already mentioned what an argument is. An argument is It's a series of statements that are coming together to try to convince somebody of something. It's a series of statements. Each of these statements can be true or false. And how these statements are connected leads you to the advancement or leads you to providing support for another statement, which we call the conclusion. The conclusion is the point of the argument. The conclusion is not necessarily the last sentence or statement in the argument. It's the point that is trying to be advanced. And everything else that is provided in the argument, well, not everything else, because there can be things in the argument that are just sort of rhetorical flair and do not act as premises. But there are a few other statements. There should be at least one other statement in this argument, which serves as the premise, which serves as the supporting for the point. Okay. So let me go into the next one here. Any questions or comments with regards to that? So now let's look at some specific arguments. I want to make a distinction between factual issues and non-factual issues. Just consider this argument. This is an argument, okay? You have two premises that are combining to lead to a conclusion. Studying logic is better than nothing. Nothing is better than ice cream. Therefore, studying logic is better than ice cream. That makes sense? It does appear to be logical, okay? This first statement, this first premise seems to lead or connect meaningfully into the second premise or statement, and then both of them in conjunction seem to lead to this conclusion. But you start to see that there's something sort of, even though it appears logical, there's something that doesn't make too much sense. And we'll talk about what that is. Okay, studying logic is better than nothing. Nothing is better than ice cream. Therefore, logic is better than ice cream. So that's an example of a deductive argument. So let's talk about inductive arguments and deductive arguments. We'll spend more time talking about inductive arguments next class. This one I'll have to come back to here, this Wason selection task. But we have a little bit of time. Let's do it. We have 4 cards. You're going to get the wrong answer. Let me just say you're going to get the wrong answer. They give this to university students. They give this to university students in the US. And 80% of university students arrive at the wrong answer. And there's a point to be made here. Hopefully I won't forget this point. There's a point to be made here about, actually, let me just make the point now, about how willing we are to accept a conclusion. We have a tendency to accept a conclusion simply because we are already in agreement with the conclusion that the person is presenting. But just because we know that the conclusion is right doesn't mean that it's a good argument. So we have a tendency to like people or side with arguments that already sort of align with what we think we already know. And we thereby do not pay as much attention to the reasons that are being presented as we should. And so what I'm trying to say is, just because you are aligned with the conclusion of an argument, you may otherwise accept a bunch of nonsense that is being presented in the premises that actually don't add up, and or they might not even be meaningfully connected to the conclusion. Let me give you one example. Yeah, you might say you might encounter somebody and say, oh yeah, I believe in climate change. And you say, okay, great, they believe in climate change, so we're on the same team. But you haven't figured out why they believe in climate change. And they say, I believe in climate change because the United States government has technology that can modify the weather, and that's what they're doing. So then you start to realize that, okay, yeah, they have arrived at the same conclusion as you, but they've arrived at a conclusion from a completely different route, okay, completely strange route. And furthermore, and this is what's interesting with some arguments and some deductive arguments, is you can arrive at a true conclusion or a good conclusion with completely bogus premises. So I'll give you an example of that in a second. But here's the task. And as I said, 80% of you guys are going to get this wrong. There are 4 cards. Each card has a number on one side and a letter on its other side. Okay, so you can imagine these are 4 gray cards. Okay, you can overturn them. We don't know what's on the other side of these cards. And you're asked to verify a rule. The rule is, if a card has an even number on one face, then its opposite face is a vowel. And the question is, which card or cards would you overturn in order to verify that this rule is being upheld. If a card shows an even number on one face, then its opposite face is a vowel. And you don't want to overturn any cards unnecessarily. So what cards would you overturn? Anybody want to take a guess? Who wants to do me a favor and speak up? No guesses?
Just a second, let us think. Okay.
Anybody have an answer? If a card shows an even number on one face, then its opposite face is a vowel.
The first and second.
The first and second. So the 8 and the E. That is the most common answer. That's what 80% of university students give. And it's the wrong answer. Okay? Because the 8 is pretty obvious. Okay? If a card shows an even number, the 8 is an even number. So I need to check what's behind the 8. I need to make sure that it's a vowel. And then we get tempted by the vowel. We see that it's a vowel. And so we say, well, here's a vowel. So I need to check to see if there's an even number behind it. Does the rule say that? The rule says that, let me try to put it this way. All even numbers have a vowel on their opposite side. Does it say that all vowels have even numbers on their opposite side? It does not. Okay. So I'll try to give you an example of that. But you know, you might say all Labradors are dogs, but not all dogs are Labradors. So we've imposed something. We've interpreted the logicality of this as being a necessary two-way street. That if something is an even number, it has to have a vowel. Therefore, we end up falsely concluding if something is a vowel, it must have an even number. That's simply not true. Okay, that's not implied here. The K doesn't seem, I mean, the 3 doesn't have much to do with anything. The answer here is you have to overturn the 8 to make sure the rule is being upheld. And you have to overturn the K because the K could be breaking the rule. In other words, let me try to put it one, well, I'll break this down a little bit further, a little bit later on. But if the E has an even number behind it, fine, but it's more like so be it. It has nothing to do with anything. Actually, if there is an even number, then you might think that you did a good job of verifying it, and you would feel as though it had to be that way. But no, it actually didn't have to be that way. It just so happened to be that way. And now you're interpreting it as being more meaningful than it is. Okay. What you need to overturn is the 8, obviously, and the K. Why? Because if the K is a consonant. If the K has an even number behind it, suppose you overturn the K and there's a 2. Now all of a sudden you have the 2, which does not have an even number behind it. You have a 2 with a K, which would break the rule. Okay. So we'll unpack the logic of this, but that is just to say that we're, at the very least, we're not good at logic in terms of abstract logic. Once I translate this little problem to a concrete example, we all automatically get the answer. Okay, but we're not good at logic in an abstract sense. So let's proceed here. We'll talk about deductive arguments, and then we'll come back to try to see how some classic deductive arguments may help us understand that problem. So here's an argument. It is an argument. We have 2 statements here that are seemingly connected, and there's an indicator word, therefore, which is indicating the conclusion, and therefore is indicating that because of this, somehow this. Okay, Herbert is 4 years old, therefore the sun will shine tomorrow. That's an argument. Is it a good argument? In other words, are you more likely persuaded to accept that the sun will shine tomorrow because Herbert is 4 years old? There doesn't seem to be any meaningful connection here. There's no logical connection. So there's actually quite a bit missing here for this argument to even be remotely reasonable. But it is an argument. Because of this, therefore that. Because Herbert is 4 years old, therefore the sun will shine tomorrow. Pretty bad argument, but nonetheless an argument. So let's consider this. And this is one of the key concepts that I want you to retain. This concept of validity. Is an argument valid or invalid? And what we mean by validity is the argument logic? Does it carry a logical necessary structure to the conclusion? Is it coherent? That's a little bit abstract. Let me try to give you some concrete examples. If you say Jim is left-handed and Tim is left-handed, therefore everybody is left-handed. Is the conclusion necessarily true? Now you suppose, let's just assume, we don't know Jim and we don't know Tim, but let's give the argument the benefit of the doubt, and let's say that we assume that the first statement is true, Jim is left-handed. We assume that the second statement is true, that Tim is left-handed. So these are the premises. We assume that the premises are true. Are we necessarily required logically to accept the conclusion? Yes or no? The answer is no. Because this can be true, but I'm not logically required to accept the truth of the conclusion. So let me try to give you, how can we modify this in such a way that, what can we add to it or remove from it or modify it so that the premises would necessarily force us to accept the conclusion? That if we were to accept the premises, we would necessarily also have to accept the conclusion. So you might say something like, anybody have an idea? What would we add or subtract, or how would we modify this so that the conclusion would be, we would be forced to accept the conclusion if we were to accept the premises? Anybody have
You can say some people are left-handed.
Okay, good. If we modify the conclusion to not everybody, but some people are left-handed, then the conclusion seems to be true if we're accepting the premises. That's good. Anybody else? There's a few ways that we can modify this. Anybody else?
If you say that everyone includes only Jim and Tim, then that
Okay,
would make the conclusion right.
Yeah, okay, good. So if you say, you add a third premise, which would be something like, there's only Jim and Tim, there's only Jim and Tim in the room, therefore everybody in the room is left-handed. That becomes necessarily logical. That is to say, you would not be able to say, it's true that Jim is left-handed, it's true that Tim is left-handed, it's true that it's only Jim and Tim, but I'm not willing to accept that everybody's left-handed. There would be a logical rift there, it would be incoherent to say that. Or you say like, Jim and Tim, everybody else is dead. There was an asteroid, wiped out everybody else. So everybody is literally only Jim and Tim. It becomes valid. Okay, let me give you, let me see, at this point, a few more examples. Let's start with Socrates here. I wish I could write this. If I had a blackboard, it would help. And notes. Let me see if I can do this here. Drawing. This is going to be a bit messy. I don't know if I want to get into this. I'm just going to ask you to write this down. Okay, I don't want to start messing around with this experimentally. So you could just, I'm going to say, okay, first argument. Socrates, don't write the whole name. So just say, S is a man. Socrates is a man. Yeah, that's your first line. Write it down on a piece of paper. Socrates is a man. S is a man. Then you write, all men are mortal. So S is a man, all men are M or mortal. And so what can you conclude from this? If I say Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, what is the necessary conclusion that I can derive from that?
Socrates is mortal.
Socrates is mortal. Okay, I conclude, therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's my conclusion. Okay, this is what we call, that's a kind of a classical argument. That's what we call a valid argument, but it's even more than a valid argument. It's what we call a sound argument. So there's a distinction to make here. Let me make that distinction now. And I'll tell you why we make the distinction. A valid argument is one that is logical, okay? And a sound argument is a logical argument where the premises are also true. So in this case, we know that Socrates is a man. We know that all men are mortal. So not only is this argument logical, but it's even better than logical. It actually leads us to a true conclusion. So this is a sound argument, is a logical argument with true premises. So it forces you to go to a true conclusion. And that's a killer argument. If you give somebody a sound argument, it's a killer argument. Okay. So let's modify this argument. If I say Socrates is, and in front of men, I'm going to put, instead of men, I'm going to put Socrates is a woman. Okay, you could just sort of modify it. Socrates is a woman. All women are immortal. Therefore, again, the logical conclusion would be Socrates is immortal. Now, this is obviously false. It's a false argument. Socrates is a woman. All women are immortal. Therefore, Socrates is immortal. is that argument still valid? And the answer is Socrates is a woman. All women are immortal. Socrates is immortal. This is a false argument, but it's a valid argument. So that's what we mean by validity. Validity has nothing to do with whether the parts of the argument are true or false. Validity has to do with the structure of the argument, the coherent flow of the argument. So if you say, if I were to accept the premises, in other words, suppose I don't know anything about Socrates or women or immortality. Okay, suppose I came from another planet. I didn't know anything about these things. And I just assumed that what you were telling me was true. Let's assume that Socrates is a woman. Let's assume that Socrates is immortal. It would nonetheless be valid to conclude that Socrates is immortal. You understand? That's what we mean by a valid argument. A valid argument does not have to be a true argument. But if the parts are true, it makes it a better argument. It turns a valid argument into a sound argument, which is even better. Okay. Any questions with regards to that? Let me give you another example. Okay. If I say, Socrates is born in Montreal. Montreal is a city in Greece. Therefore, Socrates is Greek. Is that a valid argument? Socrates is born in Montreal. Montreal is a city in Greece. Therefore, Socrates is Greek. Is that a valid argument? Yes or no? If, again, it's the if you assume that the premises are true, would you also be required to accept the conclusion? Is the argument logical? And the answer is yes. Okay. So, is Socrates is born in Montreal? That's false. Montreal is a city in Greece. That's also false. But the two false statements combining nonetheless connect in a meaningful way that lead us to a true conclusion. So Socrates is Greek is a true conclusion. It's a valid argument. And now that's the point that I was trying to make, is you can arrive at a good conclusion and therefore give more credibility to the argument, even though how we arrived at that conclusion, and it's a valid argument, is completely bogus. So, yeah, go ahead.
I don't understand what's a sound argument.
A sound argument is, if I say Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, that's valid and it's sound. If I say Socrates is a woman, all women are immortal, therefore Socrates is immortal, it's valid, but it's unsound. So sound, valid has to do with, is this argument logical or not? Okay, that's valid. Sound has to do with, are the parts of the argument also true? So it's a separate consideration. Hopefully that makes sense. We'll talk about, I want to come back to this next class and I'll put it on the board when we're back in when we're back in the classroom. But sound has to do with whether the parts of the argument, whether the statements that are used in the argument are true or false. Whereas validity has to do with the structure of the argument, independent of true or false. When you're considering validity, you're assuming that everything that is giving to you is true. And let me make a point to that. Why do we do that? You say, well, I already know that this argument is false, or I already know that it's true. What's the point of talking about validity? Because validity is a more fundamental consideration. It's more hardcore. Let me give you an example. Suppose you are you're a lawyer and you're defending your client who's accused of a crime. There are two ways that you can diffuse the argument of the prosecution. One way that you can diffuse the argument of the prosecution is by using the sort of idea of soundness. You can attack the truth of the evidence that they've presented against your client. Okay, you can say, you've presented exhibit A, but I want to show that exhibit A should be disqualified. Or you presented exhibit B against my client, but I want to show that that's actually false. Or you presented exhibit B, but I want to show that that's actually evidence that was manipulated. okay? Or you presented exhibit D, but I want to show that that evidence is circumstantial. In other words, I want to show that your arguments are false. I want to undermine your argument by showing that the parts of the argument should not be believed in. That's one approach, and it's a pretty good approach. But there's a more hardcore approach, which is, suppose you say, you know, the judge asks you, do you want to cross-examine this evidence? Do you want to cross-examine this witness? And you say, nah, you know, I'm going to give it to them. Exhibit A, yeah, sure, I'm not even going to bother questioning. Exhibit B, I'm not even going to question that either. Yeah, sure, yeah, sure, you know, you want it, take it. Exhibit C, I'm not going to question it. Do you want to cross-examine witness for exhibit D? Nah, I'm not going to cross-examine. Now your client might just start to panic here. He's saying, well, you know, my God, I hired a bad lawyer. What's he doing? He's not undermining this person's argument whatsoever. But you're coming at it from a logical perspective. And then what you say is, let's just assume, I'm going to give you the greatest benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that everything that you've said against my client is true. I'm not going to object to it at all. I don't know whether it's true or not, but let's just for fun assume that it's true. But you go logical now. So you say, if I add exhibit A plus exhibit B plus exhibit C plus exhibit D, am I necessarily required to assume that my client committed the crime? In other words, do all of these bits in conjunction necessarily force me to say that my client committed the crime, or is there still a logical gap? In other words, what you're trying to say is, assume exhibit A, B, C, and D are true. I am still not logically required. I can still, in other words, imagine that my client did not commit the crime. In other words, you have not logically guaranteed that my client committed the crime. In other words, there's a logical gap. There is a jump that is being made, which is sort of incomplete. You are diffusing the argument not by attacking the parts of the argument. You are diffusing the argument by showing that there is a lack of structural coherence in the argument as a whole. And that's a much more hardcore thing to do. I mean, sorry, you know, your argument is not good. Go back to the drawing board. There are connections here which are either lacking or they do not add up. There's one thing that I want to say here. This is better if I had it on the whiteboard, but it's possible. It doesn't guarantee, but so put this down, okay? You can have true premises leading to a true conclusion. So, but it's not a valid argument because the parts are all true. So if I say, for instance, my daughter's name is Sophia and she's 6 years old, therefore she likes ice cream. All those things are true, but she doesn't like ice cream because her name is Sophia and because she's 6 years old. So just because everything is true doesn't mean that it's valid, okay? It's valid if in assuming that the premises are true, I cannot get away from accepting the truth of the conclusion. Whereas here I can say, you know, I can imagine, why is this argument invalid? I can imagine that my daughter's name is Sophia, and I can imagine that her name, that she is 6 years old. But these two things in conjunction do not require me necessarily to accept the fact that she likes ice cream. In other words, why does A and B logically force me to accept C, that she likes ice cream? It doesn't. So it's illogical. That is to say, you know, the first two things can be true, but the conclusion does not necessarily have to be true. So it would be an invalid argument. Similarly, you know, I mean, she might be lactose intolerant or something like that. Similarly, you can have a valid argument where everything is false. It's still a valid argument. So that would be the example like Socrates is a woman, all women are immortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. That's false, leading to a false conclusion. It's still valid. It's still logically coherent. So you would say that would be unsound, but valid, okay? So you can have an argument where everything is true, leading to a true conclusion. That would be Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's true, leading to a true conclusion, and there's a necessary connection between those. So that would be a valid argument and sound, because it's logical and the parts are true. And you can also have, let's say, So you can have everything be false and still be a valid argument. You can have everything be true and still be a valid argument. And you can have a combination of false premises leading to a true conclusion. That would be the example of, let's say, Socrates is born in Montreal. Montreal is a city in Greece, therefore Socrates is Greece. You arrive at a true conclusion with any combination of false premises, and that can still be valid. But it's not valid because of that. But this is necessarily true, and this I want you to retain, what I'm going to say next. An argument that has true premises but leads to a false conclusion is necessarily invalid. You can never have a valid argument that has true premises that lead to a false conclusion. It's just impossible. Okay. I'll give you maybe some. Okay, let me actually give you two examples that if I say, now you can write this one down as well. Okay, you can use you can abbreviate it if you want. If I say Abdul is a Muslim, all terrorists are Muslim, therefore Abdul is a terrorist. My conclusion is therefore Abdul is a terrorist. First of all, before we proceed, is this argument sound or unsound? It's obviously unsound. Okay, it's obviously false. Okay, there are some people that think this way. So you see, there are but is this argument valid or invalid? If you're not logical, this might sound as though this might be convincing to some people that are not, quick with their logic. Just follow it. Abdul is a Muslim. All terrorists are Muslims. Therefore, Abdul is a terrorist. Valid or invalid? Abdul is a Muslim. All terrorists are Muslims. Therefore, Abdul is a terrorist. You just shoot out an answer. Okay, you can't be like more wrong or more right, whatever. Anybody have it? Yeah, okay, something in the chat. Somebody's gonna give me something in the chat here. It's valid. Okay. Is it valid? No, it's invalid. Okay. If we accept the two premises, are we required to accept the conclusion? Abdul is a Muslim. Let's assume that it's true. All terrorists are Muslim. Let's just assume that it's true. Am I forced to accept that Abdul is a terrorist? No. How would I modify it? Now, once I modify it, you're going to see that it becomes valid. How would I modify it? If I modified it so that I switch the two terms of the second premise, so I say all Muslims are terrorists, and now I believe it becomes valid. So if I say Abdul is a Muslim, all Muslims are terrorists, I've modified the second premise. Therefore, Abdul is a terrorist. That works. Okay, that would be valid. It's still unsound, obviously, but it's valid. And another way to modify it is, again, the original version was Abdul is a Muslim. All terrorists are Muslim. Therefore, Abdul is a terrorist. That was the original way. If I switch the last term of the first statement with the last term of the conclusion, it would sound like Abdul is a terrorist. Abdul is all terrorists are Muslim. Therefore, Abdul is Muslim. That would be valid but unsound. Okay. But as I originally presented it, Abdul is a Muslim, all terrorists are Muslim, therefore Abdul is a terrorist, is invalid. Why is it invalid? It's invalid because Abdul is a Muslim, all terrorists are Muslim. That doesn't mean that all, in other words, just suppose all terrorists are Muslim, but it doesn't mean that all Muslims are terrorists. So that's why it's invalid. That those two things can be true, and yet the conclusion can still be false. You are not required to accept the truth of the conclusion. Does that make sense? Okay, let me give you another example. This is one that my cousin gave me. Okay, it surprised me. So write it down if you want, but you don't have to. He said, Donald Trump got more votes than any previous president in every previous election. Therefore, Donald Trump won. Therefore, Donald Trump actually won the last election, but he was defrauded. Is this argument necessarily true? Is it necessarily valid? Donald Trump received more votes against Joe Biden than any previous winning president in all previous historical elections. Therefore, conclusion, Donald Trump actually won the election. Okay, it sounds interesting. It sounds like fuck, but what's the problem? The problem is, yeah, but it's not necessarily true that he won because Joe Biden got more votes than Donald Trump. So ça finit là. You understand? Just follow it. If you follow it the way that it was presented, it's sort of making a deductive argument. In other words, he has received more votes. So, but it's invalid because it's a bad definition. You don't win because you've received more votes than any other previous president. You win because you receive more votes than your current opponent in this election. So it's kind of a sort of a convoluted rhetorical definition to try to make it seem as though there's something fishy. Donald Trump got more votes than every previous president in history. Therefore, how could he have not won? He could have not won because he didn't get as many votes as Biden. Actually, he didn't even get as many votes as Hillary Clinton in the previous election. Okay, so a very invalid argument, but presented in such a way that it could fool some people. Okay, are there any questions? Let me see what time we got here. Any questions or comments with regards to this? Let's go a little bit further. We'll come back to this whole thing with validity next class, but I want you to understand how we're defining validity. A valid argument is one in which, if I accept the premises as true, I'm also then required logically to accept the conclusion as true. Okay. And again, if you detect that the person believes that they are presenting a valid argument or a valid definition, when on closer examination they are not, that is a very good thing to bring up. It's a very good part of an analysis of somebody's ideas, that they think that they're being logical, but there's a sort of a logical gap there. So keep that in mind if you come across something like that in your presentation. Okay, so then again, what were we saying with a sound argument? An argument is deductively sound if it is valid and it also has true premises, because we said a valid argument can be completely false, but nonetheless valid. Like Socrates is a woman, all women are immortal, therefore Socrates is immortal. A sound argument is one that is valid plus it's true. Okay, like Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That would be a sound argument because it's valid and it's true. Okay, now let's consider an inductive argument. If I say Sam, Sid, and Dan are all left-handed, Sam and Sid have difficulty using a can opener designed for right-handed people, therefore Dan will also likely have difficulty. Is this necessarily true? Is the conclusion necessarily true? No, it's not necessarily true. And it's not being presented in that way. It's sort of being presented more sort of, an inductive argument is more probabilistic. It's more of a sort of a reoccurrence of a pattern. Okay, it's more like I have this data, therefore I'm expecting this sort of pattern to approximately keep up. There's no guarantee that Dan will have difficulty, but you might say, but I'm willing to bet on it. An inductive argument is, if an inductive argument is strong, if it's a good inductive argument, you would say, I don't know for sure, there's no guarantee that the conclusion is going to be true, but I'm willing to believe that it's true. Okay, so let's just make that comparison. We have arguments. On one side, we have deductive arguments. A deductive argument is more mathematical. It's more logical. It's more rigid. And what a deductive argument is, it sets up an argument so that the conclusion is guaranteed. Okay, it's a sort of 100% necessarily true kind of thing. An inductive argument is more statistical. It's more probabilistic, and it doesn't pretend to guarantee the conclusion. An inductive argument is saying, hey, look, if you're accepting the premises that I'm giving you, then you should be more sort of willing to accept the conclusion, but it's never guaranteed. So we'll talk about that one a little bit more next class. But for instance, let me give you one version right now. And you can do everything right in an inductive argument, and you still might be wrong because it's just probabilistic. You know, if you're doing, let's say, if you're running a poll for the next election, and you're a very good polling institution, and you say, okay, whatever, the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party is going to win with a 7-point margin, and you've interviewed thousands of people to arrive at this. On multiple occasions, you've interviewed people. You still might be wrong, just by of no fault of your own. Everything that you did was good. Just by sheer probability, there's a chance that you're wrong. We'll talk about that next class. Okay. But suppose if I say, how do you know the sun is going to rise tomorrow? It's a sort of an interesting, important question. How do you know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? Do you know necessarily, mathematically, with physical necessity why the sun will rise tomorrow? No, you don't. Okay, we're not astrophysicists. We don't know why necessarily the sun is going to rise tomorrow. The sun may go supernova overnight. Okay, highly unlikely. But the point is, we all assume that the sun is going to rise tomorrow because of a sort of an inductive argument. You say, well, there's been day and night every day for the entirety of my life. Therefore, I'm willing to bet that tomorrow there's also going to be, this cycle of day and night. You don't know that with certainty. You do not know that with certainty. Okay, if you're honest with yourself, you're going to say, well, I don't know for sure, but I'm willing to bet 99.99999999999% on it. And you should be willing to bet everything on it, because if the sun don't rise tomorrow, then there's not much to wake up to. Okay, so it's pretty much over. So that's what a deductive argument is. Okay, an inductive argument. An inductive argument is an extrapolation of a pattern in data. I've observed this in the past, and therefore I'm willing to project it onto some future instance. So you say, I was going to school, I was stuck in traffic on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Therefore, I learned my lesson. I'm expecting the same amount of traffic on Friday, so I have to leave 10 minutes earlier. Otherwise, I'm going to be late. Okay. You might be wrong, because you might get on the road on Friday and then suddenly there is no traffic. Okay. Just for whatever, random probability. There's either something that you didn't take into account, like a holiday, or just for some reason, just by sheer statistical chance, more people decided to stay home, or a bunch of people got COVID and stayed home, and there was just an easement of traffic. Okay, but you were right. Were you right in assuming that there would have been traffic? Yeah, it would have been fair to say. I mean, I wouldn't say that it was a bad argument. I've been stuck in traffic 4 days in a row, therefore I'm expecting traffic today. That's fair. It's a strong argument. It's a reasonable argument. Okay, that's what we mean by a inductively strong argument. So my point is, let's go back to this. Would you be willing to assume, based on what is provided here, that Dan will also have difficulty with the scan opener? Yes or no? Is it a strong argument? In other words, is what we know about Salmon did, is it meaningful in extrapolating some idea of what's going to happen with Dan? Yes or not? Yes or no? Nobody wants to help me out here? Everybody's gone silent. Yes or no? I think that it is. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to bet the house that Dan is also going to have difficulty, but it does seem to be relevant. What is being provided as evidence, as premises, does seem to be relevant in augmenting my assessment of what's going to happen with Dan. So I'm going to say, well, I don't know with 100% confidence, but I would say we already have 2 people of the 3 that have difficulty. So I would say, maybe there's a 66% chance that Dan is also going to have difficulty. So it's not necessarily true, but it's likely to be true. How can I increase the strength of this argument? What can I add to this argument so that my willingness to assume that Dan will also have difficulty, I'll feel more confident in that willingness? What would I add? Anybody can add something here? How can we modify this argument to make it better? Going once, going twice, everybody's gone silent. You're going to see, you're not going to be that silent when we're back in person next week. Well, one thing that I can add, the obvious thing that you can add here is simply more people. If I have, instead of comparing 2 people to one individual Dan, if I have 20 people, and then I'm going to try to extrapolate something about Dan, now I have sort of more data, and that data increases my confidence in the conclusion. If I have 1 million people, and Dan is the 1,001st left-handed person, does that guarantee, if all 1 million people that came before have had difficulty with the scan opener, it's very, very likely that the same thing will apply to Dan. He has the same characteristic. It's likely to apply to Dan. Is it guaranteed? No. With an inductive argument, it's never guaranteed, because Dan might be the 1,001st person, and all of a sudden he's the left-handed person that doesn't have difficulty with a can opener. Okay, he's the 1 in a million. So there's no guarantee. So let's just consider this here. This is what we get: a bad argument. We get something like, every time the Canadians have won on Super Bowl Sunday, the NFC team has gone on to win the Super Bowl. The Canadians just won their game, their hockey game. So I'm gonna bet, on the LA Rams. Does that make sense to you? Is this a meaningful argument? And if there may be such a pattern, it may be that there are these sort of long, strange streaks that we can't explain. So how could we explain this? You either say that there are sort of the sports gods, up on Mount Olympus, and they are monitoring all the sports that are taking place on any given day. And they make there's these sort of mystical connections that we don't understand. That when the Canadians win their hockey game in a different country, in a different league at a different time, the sports guys sort of congregate, and they send the winds of fortune to change the result of a different sport in a different country, in a different league, okay, later on in that day. You would have to, in other words, you would have to evoke some sort of magical thinking to believe that there's a connection. Otherwise, you would have to attribute this streak, and there may very well be a streak here, but you would attribute the streak to nothing other than just sheer coincidence, sheer probability. So that's what we get, okay? I remember when I was in high school, in the playoffs, these TSN guys, okay, James Duffy and all these guys, they had this monkey spin the wheel. And the monkey would spin the wheel and pick the winners of the games for each of the hockey playoffs. Okay. And this particular monkey, that fucking year, okay, he went like 27 correct predictions and 0. This monkey was on fire. But now, how do we account for that? We account for that by the fact that any animal randomly spinning a wheel should fall within the realm of probability of, half right and half wrong. The monkey doesn't know what the hell he's doing. Okay. The monkey is almost like animal abuse here. And we forget about all the other animals that made predictions, like RDS had this octopus that would swim in a tank, and it would go towards a food tank that either had the Montreal logo or the Boston logo on it. But that octopus did a terrible job, okay? It actually went 0-25. So we don't talk about the octopus. We don't talk about all the animals that go 50-50. And every once in a while, just by sheer random statistical distribution, you're going to have an animal that goes on a hot streak. And then people get, well, the TSN monkey said the Canadians are going to win. So, I'm going to the bank and I'm taking out all my money and I'm going to put it on the Canadians. Not the best idea. Okay. You have to realize when evidence and when information is relevant that actually meaningfully contributes to the augmentation of the likelihood of the conclusion, and when it does not. Okay. It's like, and there's all kinds of strange connections that people make. Okay, this is also how you get, let's say, superstitious. I went on the ice with my left skate first, and we lost the game. And every time I go on the ice with my right skate, we win the game. And therefore, it sort of gets, drilled into you, and it becomes a very strong habit, and you start to take it very seriously. But it's nothing other than coincidence. I had a better example. It sort of eludes me. And then the point is, people start to make sort of connections with all kinds of things, like, if the singing of the national anthem during the Super Bowl is over 2 minutes, then the coin flip is when they decide who's going to kick off first. That usually comes out heads. And when the singing of the national anthem is under 2 minutes, then the coin flip is tails. Yeah, sure, there may be a connection there, but what can it be other than just a random streak of coincidence? So keep that in mind. Let me skip over it. There are some implicit premises that we have to be mindful of. Actually, let me just make a point here very quickly. Anyone who craves political power cannot be trusted to serve the public interest. Therefore, the next mayor cannot be trusted to serve the public interest. So there's an implicit premise here, which is anyone who runs for mayor of the city craves political power. That is not stated, and that's fine. It's sort of because it's implied. So we do this for sort of conciseness. We don't necessarily, unless you're a lawyer, lawyers really spell out every single little detail. But most people in spoken language will sort of jump over premises. There will be implicit premises. And there's two ways of understanding that. The first way to understand that is precisely what I just said, is it's just sort of for economy of speech. But you have to watch out when people do this, because sometimes people do this because they are trying to undermine or omit information which is implied, which they do not want to make explicit because it won't sound good. Okay, so be mindful of when premises are hidden and what's being hidden, and is it being hidden for any rhetorical intention? Okay, but that's just a side point. Okay, so let's try to make sense of here in the next 10 minutes or so. some common arguments, and this I'll come back to next class because I want to recap it on the board. But these are some arguments that are always valid, and we'll see how it connects to that whole thing at the beginning with the vowels and the letters. This argument is called, I don't want you to remember the Latin name here, modus ponens. This argument is always valid. So if I say something like, this horseshoe is an arrow, is an implication. This implies that. So P might represent something like, if I am in Paris, I am in Paris, I am in France. So this would read, if I am in Paris, then I am in France. I just landed in Paris, therefore I must be in France. That's necessarily true. That's a valid argument no matter what you put in there. When I am in Montreal, I am in Quebec. I am in Montreal, therefore I must be in Quebec. Okay. If I answer my phone, then my phone must have a battery charge. I was able to answer my phone. Therefore my phone did have a charge left on the battery. No matter what you put in there is valid. Okay. If I pass the test, then I'll pass the class. I did just pass the test. Therefore, necessarily, I already know now that I passed the class. Okay. I don't have to wait for my result. I just know logically. That's one of them. I'll put this, we'll do this again next class in person. I'll go over it because it's easier to see visually. There's another one that's always valid. If I'm in Paris, then I'm in France. I'm not in France. Therefore, I cannot possibly be in Paris. That's valid. Okay. If I answer my phone, then my battery is dead. Sorry. If I answer my phone, then my battery has a charge. My battery does not have a charge. Therefore, I cannot possibly answer my phone. Okay. If I pass the class, then I pass the test. I did not pass the test. Therefore, I did not pass the class. Something along those lines. No matter what you put in there, so long as you, this little squiggle is not the negation of Q. Okay. So let's see how this connects to our little project here. So what we, and I'll come back to this next class, but what we want to do is the first one is, if a letter shows an even number, then its opposite side is a vowel. I do have an even number. Therefore, I need to check that its opposite side is a vowel. Okay. And this would be, if a card shows an even number, then its opposite side is a vowel. I do not have a vowel. I have a consonant, K. Therefore, the opposite side cannot be an even number. Okay. So that would be the application of the first little logical argument. And this would be the application of the second little logical argument. What are the fallacies? When does it doesn't work? It would be something like, if P, then Q, and you say Q, conclude P, or if you say if P, then Q, and you say not P, and you conclude not Q. So what would that look like? If I say, if I'm in Paris, then I'm in France. I am in France, therefore I'm in Paris. Is that valid or invalid? It's not necessarily true, so it's invalid. If I am in Paris, then I am in France. I am in France, therefore I must be in Paris. That's not necessarily true, because I might be in Bordeaux, I might be in Nice, I might be in Marseille. Okay, so it's true that when I am in Paris, I am in France. That's true. And it might be true that I am in France, but it's not necessarily true that I must accept that I'm in Paris. So that's invalid. So that's the problem that we make here. Okay. If a card shows an even number, then its opposite faces a vowel. I have a vowel, and then I conclude that I must therefore have an even number. In the same way, I am in France, therefore I must be in Paris. No, it's not necessarily true. I might be in Paris, but not necessarily. Okay, so keep that in mind. And the other fallacy would be like the E, which would be even worse, would be an even number has a vowel behind it. I don't have an even number, therefore there can't be a vowel behind it. So that would be like, if I am in Paris, then I am in France. I'm not in Paris, therefore I'm not in France. Is that logical? Is that necessarily true? No. If it's true that when I am in Paris, I will be in France. That's first premise. But I'm not in Paris, so I cannot be in France. No, again, I might be somewhere else in France. Okay, so it's like, let me see. If he answers his phone, then his battery has a charge. He didn't answer his phone, then his battery must be dead. No, maybe his battery's not dead. Maybe he just doesn't want to fucking talk to you. You know, so it's not necessarily true. Okay, we'll come back to that. So if you change it to a sort of you change the logic around, then it makes a bit more sense. I have to start wrapping this up. Okay. So if you say, which cards would you overturn? You go into a house party and you're a police officer, you want to verify that this rule holds. If you are drinking alcohol, you must be over 18 years old. What would you verify? Okay. The fallacy that we make in the previous one is there's nothing that says that if you are over 18 years old, you must be drinking alcohol. That's what we do with the E. We have an E, therefore it must have an even number behind it. Okay. Nothing that says if you are over 18, you must be drinking alcohol. So what do you need to verify? You need to verify that the 17-year-old is not drinking alcohol, and you need to verify that whoever's drinking the beer is over 18. But the rule does not require that being over 18. It doesn't require that the 21-year-old have an alcoholic beverage in his hand. So you see the logic becomes much better there. This is another way to put it. Okay, under what circumstance would you say that Bob broke his promise? If Bob says, "If I get paid, I'll take you to lunch," so you have four possibilities. Bob gets paid, he takes you to lunch. Bob does not get paid, he doesn't take you to lunch. Bob gets paid and he doesn't take you to lunch, and Bob doesn't get paid, but he takes you to lunch. Four possibilities. When would you say he broke his promise? The only time you would break his promise, so let's consider, if he doesn't get paid, but he doesn't take you to lunch, would you say he broke his promise? Bob says, "If I get paid, I'll take you to lunch." He doesn't get paid, he doesn't take you to lunch. Would you say he broke his promise? No, you would say his promise is still good. If he does get paid and he does take you to lunch, you would say, did he break his promise? No, his promise is still good. If he doesn't get paid, but he still takes you to lunch, did he break his promise? No. Actually, you would say, actually, when you get paid, you got to take me to another lunch. The only time you would say that Bob broke his promise is when he does get paid, but he doesn't take you to lunch. Okay, let's see here. So two more, and again, I'll come back to this. I'm going a little bit faster. These are arguments that are always valid. Okay, this is a chain rule, hypothetical syllogism. If I pass the test, then I'll pass the class. If I pass the class, then I'll graduate. Therefore, if I pass the test, then I'll graduate. Okay, this chain rule. This can also be used rhetorically for, let's say, what we call the slippery slope fallacy. Politicians, you like to use this to create a sort of this idea of like sort of a negative downward slope that's unavoidably going to lead to something bad. So let's say if you legalize drugs, then you're going to legalize, if you legalize marijuana, you're going to end up legalizing all drugs. If you legalize all drugs, you're going to start legalizing hard drugs. And therefore, if you legalize marijuana, then it's just a matter of time before young Timmy is washed up in a back alley somewhere with a needle in his arm. It's sort of, it's logical, it's valid, but it's an exaggeration. It's an exaggeration because it's unsound. It's unsound because they make things cause other things which aren't necessarily true. So that one's always valid, no matter what you put in it. We'll come back to it. And the last one is very simple. It's P or one or the other. So, the Rams will win or the Bengals will win. I heard on the radio that the Bengals lost, therefore the Rams must have won. Okay, you either pass this class or you fail the class. You didn't fail the class, therefore you passed the class. Okay, and this is also used rhetorically by politicians. This was George Bush's favorite. You're either with us or you're against us. Okay, you're either with us or you're against us, and you're not with us, therefore you're against us. You're either a patriot or a terrorist sympathizer, and you don't look like a patriot to me, therefore you're a terrorist sympathizer. Again, exaggerated stuff. So we'll come back to this next class. We'll recap that and we'll talk about inductive arguments. Any questions or comments with regards to that? That was a little bit long, but thanks for sticking around.